Thanks to everyone for joining us today. I know we're in for a very interesting discussion and really appreciate the fact that you're here. And please do get involved in terms of putting questions or comments in the chat throughout, and we'll address them as we go. We want to make this as valuable and engaging as possible. And so we appreciate you kind of jumping in and sharing your insights and questions with us. Well, I'm Diane Chase. As Jessica mentioned, I am Senior Vice President with C4CS, and we specialize in strategic communication and crisis management, precisely tuned to protect and enhance reputation, stakeholder trust, and the bottom line. Our team has successfully worked with corporate, nonprofit, and government partners around the world. And through our strategic consulting and skills building workshops, media trainings, crisis communications training, and executive communication coaching, we do our very utmost to provide solutions that, simply put, help our client partners become smarter and more competitive. So that's a little bit about C4CS. And now to the most important thing. Joining us from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, is Yukori Ajebe. She is a strategic communications and public policy professional with vast government, public sector, and nonprofit project management experience. She has developed and managed large-scale communications and development projects and across various disciplines as well, in Africa, Europe, North America, and Asia for private and public sector clients. She served as the Strategic Communications, Change Management, and Partnerships Advisor at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, and she supported the Nigeria Center for Disease Control, and in that role, she actually led the crisis communication response for COVID-19 in Nigeria. And super interesting, Yukori is now documenting her experience and contributing to leading conversations around the globe around the COVID-19 crisis communication response. She holds a bachelor's degree in economics and a master's in public policy from the National University of Singapore and a master's in public affairs from, I need my basic French, Institut d'études politiques de Paris. How'd I do? Was that okay? And I do, as we jump into our Q&A session here, just did want to mention that the examples that we will showcase today around best practices, lessons learned, where people stubbed their toes, did not do as well as perhaps they could have, are based around basically a rubric, if you will. And there are 6 points that we'll discuss and that Yukori will kind of measure up against the cases. And those are trust and credibility, empathy, autonomy, speed, internal communication, and values and stories. So with that said, I want to jump right in. And you know, crisis is what Yukori and I love to talk about, super passionate about. And in the trainings that we do at C4CS, we use the Chinese symbol for crisis. And that symbol is actually made up of 2 characters. One signifies danger and one signifies opportunity. And in that light, I feel that that is the mindset we need to approach a crisis with when we're talking about management and communication. If a crisis is handled well, it's actually an opportunity to enhance and build your reputation unlike any other opportunity you'll have. Conversely, if it's mismanaged, if there's miscommunication, if there's a lot of heads blowing up, it's something that will take your reputation down to a point where it may take years to repair it, or you may never get it back. So it's so critical to understand the strategic and tactical communication skills and crisis management skills that every professional should have, every leader in any organization really should have. So with that said, shall we begin? Yukori?
Yes,
All
please.
right. Thank you so much for joining us today. Well, let's just be, going back to the basics a little bit. And what would you say constitutes good communication during a crisis?
I think, it's just for me thinking about the first thing that I thought about when, we started responding in Nigeria was going back to the basics. How do we want to come out? Right? And that goes back to trust. So you start with the end in mind. How would you like your organization or the government to emerge from all of this? And I think that that's one of the things that, I really concentrated on, starting the response in the first place. So having said that, right, because for me, it felt like a very big burden. The trust is on your head, right? So no matter what you do at the end of the day, for me, it was even, can we just emerge, okay from this crisis? I mean, the best way is to emerge the best and reputation managed and all of that. But if not, can we still come out just moderate enough in a way that we can rebuild without having a lot of pressure? Mm-hmm. So with that, really, first things first was to examine what just happened here, or what is happening in the first place, right? And examining that is, also trying to tease out facts. And, with COVID in the beginning, there were no facts really. So we were kind of updating as we went and all of that. So it was one of the things that was a very big challenge, whether it was for organizations who didn't know how it was evolving, or for governments where I sat in, we didn't know what to tell a population of about 200 million, in the sense that we did not understand or know fully what the facts were, to say to them, okay, this is what is happening and this is how long it would take to resolve this and we'll get back to normal. We couldn't say that, and we didn't have those facts in terms, it was evolving. So I think that, examining what happened first, even understanding who the stakeholders were. I don't like to use the word general public. It kind of irks me a little bit because you can't really capture people by saying, oh, it's a general public. There are different nuances, right? Especially when you're, in this case for COVID, looking at doing a lot of risk communications as well, you definitely needed to segment and segregate and say, okay, these are some of the audiences that we'll focus on. Maybe these are the type of needs that they have. And, these are some of the messages that they would need and channels, we can reach them through. But one thing we knew we'd not want to do was plan to be silent, right? We knew that we could not be silent. And with other organizations as well, it wasn't a time to keep quiet and watch on the sidelines, even without knowing the full information. It was like, this is what is happening, or this is what has happened, right? The information is evolving, but at the same time, we will let you know as we find out more information, as transparent as we could be. And also one big thing, I think in times of crisis, and especially COVID, was speed, right? From my own experience, it was, how do we speak first without having rumor and misinformation come through? So when the first case in Nigeria came, the government announced first, right? And the information did not leak because there was a lot of speed that happened between identifying, tracing, and announcing to Nigerians, this is actually what is happening. So speed is also, very important, as well as frequency. Nigeria, as well as other countries, started communicating, almost on a daily basis, telling people this is what is happening, this is what to expect, this is what we know, and this is how you can protect yourself. And Interestingly, who is speaking at every point in time? It's not everyone that, will gravitate towards whoever you bring on board to speak. So whoever is speaking is very important. It has to be someone who is trusted. Then again, so that's why I don't like to say general public, because when you go that way, you don't capture everyone, because you might feel like maybe it is the president or the head of the Centers for Disease Control that is a trusted figure, but in a crisis like that, they might not be the trusted figures that people want to listen to at that point in time. So it's really important to to understand that. And for me, one last thing that I'll mention, and as we have the conversation, a lot more will come up, is authenticity. Whether it's authenticity of, an organization delivering messages during a crisis, saying this is what we know, being transparent, saying it as it is and meaning it, right? Or a government, being authentic with their citizens when there's a crisis. It's extremely important in a crisis, because that's when people would listen and feel like there's a connection. Feel like you care for them.
Yep.
Because, especially with COVID, it's very heightened. It was a very heightened situation, and still is, right? For a lot of people everywhere. There's uncertainty. There's, people losing their jobs, health-wise, dying, their mental health issues. So when you're in a position of power, whether as an organization that people look up to, or a government that people want direction and care from, just having that authentic voice is extremely important in a crisis.
Absolutely. Now more than ever, leading with empathy and compassion and being a real human, right? Not being as formal, being very outgoing and proactive and saying, we're all humans and we are in this together. And how can I address your questions? How can I address your needs in a way that is meaningful to them? What are their concerns? What are they caring about? What's happening with them personally, right? Because they're bringing that to their work. They're bringing that to their job. And so reaching out as a human being in your leadership role and showing that you do care about whatever internal and external stakeholders you have really goes a long way to building trust, preserving brand, and again, building that reputation. And it's so critical to align those crisis communication messages with your brand and with your culture. Because if you have that disconnect, that is really going to derail whatever communication you're putting out there. And as you mentioned, always keeping in mind, even before you start crafting those messages, which hopefully you have some standby messages already in terms of, your purpose, your mission, your values, to figure out, what does success look like on the other side? What's the goal? What are we trying to achieve? And how can we preserve our brand, our reputation, our equity on the other side of this crisis? So being very clear and aligning your messages and aligning your leadership in communicating before, during, and after a crisis. So critical. So how about some examples? Can you give us some examples specifically of what organizations should or should not do during a crisis?
That's, when I was researching and just, kind of taking a step back, because last year I felt like I was in the thick of things. So I was seeing from a particular lens. So, this is me kind of going back, reliving some of the examples or companies that I felt connected with in the last year. I think one thing is that organizations need to show the outside world what they're doing, right? When it comes to a crisis like, or a pandemic like COVID, what are the measures that you've put in place? And I always tell people to start with, their internal audience first. The employees are extremely important for people to, focus on first. So how are you working around, remote work? How are you working around people's roles and responsibilities, taking into consideration time off? Um, how can your products or your services help people in a time when they need you most? So it's not necessarily marketing to them, I need you to buy my products, but how can you use your existing infrastructure to support a big crisis like this? And I think it's one big example, for companies who have communicated in this way and said, okay, this is what I'm doing X, Y, and Z to help out with this. I think, it's very important. Another thing is, what type of tone do you use, in terms of communications? I like what you said, Diane, about being human, right? This is not a time where companies or organizations or even governments can talk in the abstract, right? It is the time to come down. That's why one of the reasons why I resonated with we're in this together, right? Was because it felt like, okay, it's not the government's work alone. It's not an organization's work alone. It's not an individual's work alone. It's all of us doing our bit to ensure that we emerge on the other side, or at least we get through this. In Nigeria, particularly, we had a campaign, Take Responsibility, which was really huge because it was saying, I know you're expecting X, Y, and Z from your government. I know you're expecting X, Y, and Z from your employer, but there's also an expectation for you in terms of washing your hands, in terms of following the guidelines, in terms of, when we started wearing a mask, and just being responsible, because you can infect others, your family, your friends, and it wouldn't be good because we don't know, there's no cure, basically. So I think that, those are some of the examples. And one of the biggest concerns, was major outbreak among staff. So I think that, in the COVID crisis, companies had a huge role to play. I was just reading up on the Edmond Barometer,
I was going
and
to
they talked about the fact, the percentage has skipped my mind, but a very high percentage of employees trust their companies and information that come from their companies,
more than
right?
government or
More than the
media or
government
journalism.
or the media or even health,
Mhm.
health professionals. And one
Right.
thing that even interested me was that social media was less trusted.
Mhm.
Um, out of everything. And you will think, but I'm starting to understand a little bit when you think about misinformation and, the amount of information that you find on social media. So I can understand why people might not want to, totally just go there and, take all the information that they will take because it might not be true.
Mhm.
Right. So I think that, in terms of companies, who have done really well, they have also focused very internally, right, as well as external, but internally in the sense that they have managed to put in systems and structures for infection prevention control for their staff. Weekly or however frequent their briefings are, going internally on how to protect yourself. And the ones that I feel have, done the most have even gone to the extent of announcing when they have outbreaks in their facilities, right? So that amount of transparency and, just caring for their constituents, not that a lot of them didn't do things externally, but that on its own would have, brought about a ripple effect. So imagine people are trusting, so they go to their families and they take it out. So, it also goes back to the principle of who is speaking, right, during a crisis, or who are you getting information from? But also puts a very big onus on governments to know that, partnerships in these times are very important in terms of reaching out to companies, having like a private public, relationship or partnerships to ensure that they're getting the correct information and updates on what is going on when they need it, so they can distill to the people who trust them. So yeah.
It really is a time more than ever to put your people first. One of my mantras in working with leaders is, if you put people and purpose as your priorities, profits will follow. And right now, your internal stakeholders, your employees, we always say, tell the family first in a crisis. You do not, how disengaged and unmotivated is any employee, much less internal leadership, going to be if they find out what's going on in their company in the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal. Like, if there's something brewing, get it out there. If you're hitting a crisis, again, tell your family first, tell the internal stakeholders. They are your most important ambassadors and can be your most powerful detractors. So they really have to be at the top of your list, especially during a crisis, more than ever. People want to feel cared about. I read some amazing statistic yesterday about the number of people who are absolutely feeling disengaged and actively looking for other opportunities or other positions. So, feed and nurture the important people in your organization. And that's by, clear, consistent communication. And, I'm sure you run into the situation too, where a lot of leaders feel like they have to have all the facts together before they say anything. And they have to know, every little bit, and they have to double check it 3 times and do all the red tape. It's not where you need to be in a crisis. Tell them what you know, what you're doing about it, and how you feel about it. You can always say those 3 things. Even if you know like just one little bit, you can say something, because as we know, when there's a lack of communication, that's when that void gets filled, and it gets filled with misinformation, facts out of context. So then you have to undo all of that in the middle of a crisis, and that's not where you want to be either. So, but it does take training. It does take skilling up your leadership to make sure that you have the right, as you mentioned, if the CEO or the head of government is not the best spokesperson for the organization during a crisis or anytime, find that key person, that person that has trustworthiness and good communication skills and speaks with clarity.
Definitely. I think, even for a lot of the communicators or companies or even governments, COVID has humbled and taught us a lot of lessons, right? And for us, it was, you don't have the information going in. So how do you release what you have and when you have it? Basically at every point in time. So on the government side, we're taking cue from the WHO and other countries in terms of how things were panning out. So we needed to be abreast, like on top of things and information. And when that comes out at any point in time, we release to the public. To the public, then go down to, the stakeholders and relationships that we had built to now disseminate the information to the target audiences that, we could not reach or might not trust the government. in terms of, this is in terms of getting out information on COVID. Yeah.
Well, let's move in. Speaking of social media a minute ago, how did the nature of COVID-19 change the delivery of communications, and what were some of the pressures that were escalated during the pandemic?
Okay, so when initially we didn't have a lockdown, right? And all of a sudden, whole countries are shutting down.
Right.
No one's going anywhere. So a lot of people now relied on, the internet, either the internet or the TVs and social media to get information on COVID and what is happening, right? And as communicators, we've had a lot of people have been using social media, but a lot of people haven't been using social media as well to communicate to their constituents. So it became a situation where digital communications was now almost at the center of, what you're doing. Most of the crisis or backlash we had was on social media, right? Or originated from social media. And also thinking about other messaging channels like WhatsApp as well. You have to just be paying attention to that as well. So it definitely was an additional pressure. It wasn't a time where you could say, okay, I would just manage a channel just on Twitter and maybe LinkedIn or, or Facebook, right? For the Nigeria Center for Disease Control, we communicated mostly on Twitter and Facebook, right? But we're now starting to understand that we had different audiences that we needed to engage due to the nature of this crisis, that were not on Facebook, that were on YouTube, that were on Instagram, that were on Telegram, right? And also on WhatsApp. So major pressure. But I think one thing that really helped was, as it was evolving, Nigeria didn't get its first case like some other countries did. So we started watching very early on. And in the communication sense, my team and I started looking at what other countries were doing as well, in terms of how they were managing the comms. And one big thing that we did was to set up a microsite, so a one-stop shop in terms of having a website where all the information that you needed to have about COVID was put on, and in a very simple way that anybody could read, right? And that really helped us, because when the partnerships with, the tech companies came, like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, WhatsApp, they had, and Google, basically, they had somewhere to direct people to. So you notice that even till today, maybe if you type in COVID-19, it tells you this is where to go for accurate information on COVID. They've done it in a number of countries, but if you're in Nigeria, it will send you to the NCDC, that's the Nigeria Center for Disease Control, to the microsite that had all that information, right? So that really started helping to ease that pressure, because, people started also even realizing that the Nigeria CDC is a trusted voice, right? When it comes to information on COVID-19, and they're the ones that are, the designated authority. So even with the engagement on social media, that also helped us a lot. For example, our following grew from like maybe 30,000 or thereabout in February of 2020. By August, we were at 1.1 million. So it was all of those efforts, right? But it was just noticing that, there was an additional pressure for the content teams to also think about digital content strategy that could be used across the platforms. So we were trying as much as we could not to put out the same content. When we were pressured, we will put out the same content, but also with monitoring and evaluation, we started learning what type of content did well on what platform and adapted as we moved. So those are some of the things that I would say, were the pressures, because people now looked up to you online. You still did the TVs and the radios, but even the content from TV and radio, we moved online as well, sometimes. And conversation with, with government officials and all of that. We started doing Facebook Lives, Instagram, IG Lives, just to ensure that we are on top of our game and engaging our key audiences online who are sitting at home, not doing much anymore and looking up to you because they're anxious.
Right. Now, what was one of the C's I have in my article about communicating during COVID and crisis for the C-suite is cadence. So how did you determine the cadence of your live video outreach and your social media postings and that kind of thing? Did you determine the cadence ahead of time, or did you kind of massage it as you went through to see when people were joining and when they were not, and that sort of thing?
Most of the times, I'll start with maybe just the setting of the messaging, right? The setting of the messaging was a whole process because we had like strategic messaging teams, data teams who would mine the conversations that are already going on a weekly and daily basis. So we're taking our cue, from there in terms of, the conversations that need to happen. But in terms of, timing and things like that, we pretty much set up when it was in a way convenience for us, because at the end of the day, people were at home, so we set up, the engagement in terms of, Facebook Lives but in terms of our content strategy, we just did like, you would have normal content strategies, and when you want to post, content, and you kind of schedule based on the conversation and the key messages that you need to put out at every point in time.
So kind of pushing on information depending on the timeliness and urgency of it and that sort of thing, but then also having a regular spot, which is real important in crisis communication, especially to have a regular time frame where your stakeholders know, especially your internal stakeholders know that they'll get a little update, even if it's not much of anything, touching base, right? Checking in.
In terms of that, what most of the Nigerians looked up to at that point in time were the numbers, right? Case numbers. So we typically announce between 11 p.m. and midnight every single day. So I know that was one of the things that they looked forward to and had a lot of memes around it, which used to make me cringe, because the people that knew that I was supporting behind the scenes would send me a message like, "Oh, we're waiting for you. Where are the numbers?"
That's actually really good, because you're now becoming a trusted source, right? And again, it's thinking about, what does success look like at the other end, when the light at the end of the tunnel is getting closer. We want to make sure that we know what we're going for and what we want people to know about us, believe about us, understand about us. And again, that reputation piece, which is so important. How did you choose the individuals who would be conducting the social media outreach, especially the Facebook Live and Instagram and things like that? Did you have one designated spokesperson, or did you have a rotating team, or how did you handle that?
So, different things will work for different people, right? So in the Nigerian scene, we had already established that we were starting from a place of very low trust for the government, right? So what we did mostly behind the scenes was to make sure that we partnered with CSOs, religious organizations. So we didn't have control over their timing on when they wanted to do events, or they wanted to speak about COVID and to their constituencies, right? But for us internally, prior to COVID, we had trained a lot of spokespeople at the NCDC, which was really, really interesting because it was something we identified that we were trying to set up, our crisis comms strategy, and it was a gap that we had the Director General as our major spokesperson. And we just said, so what if there's a big, crisis, what do we do? And that spurred the organization to partner and put up a training for about, I think it was between 18 to 20 spokespersons within the organization. So basically that was a huge lifesaver because we had different people speaking different languages. We had the Muslims, you had the Christians, but there were also like health professionals who are usually trusted most times in these cases, right? So we tried as much as possible to schedule events around, the spokespeople that we had internally. The NCDC Director General was still the major spokesperson because most times people still want to hear from him. So when we did most of the major Instagram lives or the Facebook lives, we would put him there. Because people want to get the updates from him and ask him questions directly. But on radio, TV, we'll diversify and put, other staff depending on where they're going to or what audience we want to capture at any point in time.
And so obviously your key messages will stay the same.
Yes.
But will need to be nuanced and customized to stakeholder audiences that you
Definitely.
have. So can you describe a little bit of that process and who was brought in to work on that?
Okay, so so there's the crisis comms angle of it, and there's risk communications, right? And Nigeria on its own already has like a network of risk communicators, which constitutes of people going into, the communities and all of that. And these were a lot of them. That network helped a lot with content development, right? Because we're now talking about tailoring content to particular audiences. So if we'll say, okay, we want to speak to people in the education sector, we tailor all the content to the education sector and to schools. And as I said to you, like every week, when you're dealing with a country of about 200 million people who speak different languages, have different beliefs, it is a very big challenge. And so we're also making sure that we were working very smart and strategically. So basically what we'll do is that at the beginning of the week, during the week, we would have collected information on what's going on, what the conversations that are happening are. Then we specifically address those needs for the stakeholders that are bringing that conversation up. And when we identify that, we go back in-house. So this network of, content creators, in addition with my team, will all work together to tailor the content and also think about the best medium to disseminate this information. The medium could be sending it to churches. It could be not saying much about it, right? But you help them develop that content. And because you also built relationships with them, there's a pipeline. It could be sending it to an OAP in a radio station who would have a show dedicated to COVID and talking about that particular topic. It could be developing videos. We even went to the extent of having cartoons in newspapers.
Oh, really? Oh.
Yes, we worked with cartoonists
Oh
to have cartoons in newspapers dedicated to maybe wearing your mask. Then we also had videos, that were cartoons as well, working with the creative sector as well. So it's quite interesting, right? So when you're thinking about, it's not just, especially with COVID, maybe other crises would have been a lot easier to manage, but the people affected are a lot more. So you kind of become creative and you devise, different means of reaching people. But to be honest with you, the partnerships were very key. Sometimes it was just giving them the key messages or the messages we wanted to reinforce, and they would go back and create their content and speak in a language that resonates with the people that they're speaking to. So
absolutely, such good points. And partnerships are to be built when the sun is shining and not when the storm is there.
Time.
Exactly. And they become such a powerful ally in helping you disseminate communication in a trustworthy manner, right? And if there is a crisis where there's question about your reputation, you have the benefit of the doubt because you've built this relationship and they know you, they know your values, they know your leadership, and they trust them. And so they're more willing to speak on your behalf than speak to your detriment. So partnerships built in happy times are absolutely critical, because that's in your bank of goodwill. And in a crisis, you're going to have to withdraw some of that, right? I love that. And I love the fact that you had people on the front line, so to speak, with your various stakeholder groups. So they could be an invaluable channel back to you in terms of creating the messaging and answering the questions and concerns and addressing their top of mind cares. That way you had really ears to the ground, if you will. That's fantastic. So in terms of being prepared for various, not just COVID, but various kinds of crises, what should organizations do now with their social media? How do they use social media to be a powerful tool during a crisis?
So in terms of preparedness, really, for me, is even just building that trust on social media when there's no crisis, right? That when there's actually a crisis and you speak, people can, come to you and say, okay, I'm listening to this organization because, I trust what they say. Which goes back to the basics of, do you have someone who manages your digital communications? Do you have a strategy that resonates, with your values and your mission and what you're trying to achieve? And are you authentic enough that people gravitate towards you? It's just basically maybe doing influencer work, but in a company way, where you have something good to sell to people or to say to people, and they gravitate towards you regardless of whatever is happening. But towards a crisis, they would want to say, what is XYZ company saying? What is their stance?
Right.
At this point in time, and they would come. So for me, is the basics of doing the groundwork and having, systems in place. And now for companies not to neglect social at all. Not saying to be on all social media channels, but to choose the ones that they feel work best, for them and the audiences that they're trying to target, and focus on cultivating and building from the ground up, when you're in peacetime. But also just for me now, when I think about internal and external, right? there's literally a very fine line or none remaining, in the sense that an email that you send internally can come out externally. So it's always to think about any communications that you're doing internally and externally as all external. And at every point in time, just, make sure that you're managing that, not that you're being dishonest, you're still being authentic and transparent, but knowing that, whatever you distribute internally might come out externally almost immediately. So that's one thing so you don't have a lot of crisis on on your hands that you can't manage at any point in time.
Right. So making sure again that that culture, that brand are aligned with your communication throughout, and using that as the touchstone for everything you communicate internally and externally. But I totally agree. Obviously, all my IC, internal communication colleagues, are protective of that, but I don't care too much for my notion that there's really no difference. There is a difference in, again, the nuance about, your internal stakeholders are going to care more about certain topics, certain aspects of your communication than external, but you have to be willing to have whatever you wrote internally on the front page of the paper, basically. So let's get down to some specific examples of the good, the bad, and the ugly. So how about starting with some examples of organizations that managed their crisis communication well during COVID? What exactly did they do well? What were some of the major lessons learned?
So I will do both, both government and, private sector. And before I jump into it, one point I wanted to raise was, as organizations or the government, you can't expect to respond to a crisis properly if you didn't prepare. So I think that as communications professionals, it should always be at the back of our mind that we have to prepare for scenario A, B, C, D, however it goes.
Absolutely.
And that's one of the things that, as a segue into, the examples, really impressed me about the oil and gas sectors, right? They have this already ingrained in the way they function in terms of, the scenario planning, risk management, that when we're still having conversation about, COVID in China, they had already reached out to the Nigeria CDC to say, a group of oil and gas companies in Nigeria, both the multinationals and the locals, had come together and started having conversations and watching the situation. What's happening? How do we respond? How do we support? How do we put in place the protocols we already have? Because I was privy to some of these calls. And for me, that really impressed me. And is to say that there's something to learn there about, crisis comes preparedness, or even, crisis preparedness, and that really affects the quality of your delivery. That's not to say that you can't innovate as you go, because things are changing. You have to be thinking on your feet at every point in time. But it's just to say that, the companies that have prepared more, you will definitely get a lot more in terms of their delivery and engagement and the work they've been able to do during this COVID-19 pandemic. Absolutely. So as a segue to that, my first one that really impressed me was Shell. And Shell, and just maybe using Shell Canada, but one great thing about multinationals is that when they roll out, in innovations or activities or interventions, it kind of rolls out in most of the countries that they operate in, right? But also taking into consideration the different nuances. It might not be the same in Canada and in Nigeria, but I'll take Shell Canada as the first example. In about March, they had put out a statement, we are aware, of what is happening, and this is how we're responding, in the sense that this is how we're responding, maybe taking care of our staff. This is how, our customers will be affected, and what we're doing and what we are or plan to do in the community. And a big lesson, or two big lessons for me there, are speed, right? But also empathy, right? Because they took into consideration of what is going on, the uncertainty. They've acknowledged it. They've acknowledged it very fast, on time, but also let you know, to the best of their ability, what their next steps are.
Absolutely.
Right? So you're following, you're connecting with them as a customer or as an employee. And I know firsthand that, people like Shell and Chevron also distributed, internal brochures or briefings for their staff, in terms of trying to keep them abreast of what was going on. I know a lot of companies did that, but just to mention, that. So that would be my first example, because it's one that really resonated with me, and maybe because I knew the background in terms of how things had evolved, it was really interesting to me. Another one I'll bring up, I don't know how many of you know of Hema, but is an Alibaba like food delivery company. And when COVID hit, what they did was that, we're going to launch an initiative, right, to share restaurant staff who are not working and pull them into deliveries. So it was an example of using basically what they had, to support the crisis in the way that they could. And for me, if you're a consumer or a user of the service, you're thinking, oh my gosh, I want to be associated with this brand, who is showing us what their values are, right? Who is telling us a story of how they can, be flexible, how they can support the communities that they are operating in. And once again, empathy, right? Because they are not thinking of themselves and their bottom line, but they're thinking of how can we plug into, this situation at this point in time. There are a lot of videos that went around. There are a lot of examples, but one that stood out, I don't know if any of you saw it, was a Walmart one featuring employees singing "Lean on Me," showing their staff in different locations, I think Paris, in the US, and just kind of seeing how their stores are helping customers. Again, down to the values, right? Down to the brand, down to this is what we're doing to make sure that we're helping you. We understand, we're also dealing with it ourselves. Still showing up here, look, we're showing up, but at the same time, we want to make sure that you're comfortable, you have what you need, because we're here for you. So that was very, very heartwarming. And people like Carter's as well, the children's store had, homemade signs saying, stay home, make memories. I know some governments try to do that as well. I really, as cheesy as it may sound, the UK was also really good about, changing up during their press conferences, having all these signs, stay at home, stay safe, and, all of that. But that was heartwarming that at every point in time, and as things were evolving and changing, they were also changing their key messages, right, to reflect what was going on at that particular point in time. So it's so another one that, you know, I love to travel, right? So when COVID hit, it was also a very big problem for me because I had booked flights to go X, Y, and Z. And one of the first companies who came out and said, look, we have flexible changing policies, we understand what is going on, is JetBlue in the US. And that was also very heartwarming, and, you know, also helped to calm people's fears down. Would I lose all the money that I put in buying a ticket? What does this mean? This is a lot going on, and they're telling you, okay, you know, we can refund you. You can decide to book a ticket for another time. A lot of other airlines follow suit as well, eventually. But I think just setting that precedence really early on was really great. And I know what a lot of airlines did as well was to show how they were cleaning up, you know, their aircrafts as well. I have local examples from Air Peace in Nigeria, you know, showing, you know, Nigerians how they were disinfecting their aircrafts and things like that. And airlines like, you know, the Nigerian Air Peace too helped go to other countries to evacuate Nigerians, you know, who were stranded. So that was very big mileage for them. Like even me as a comms person, I commented on their social media to say, look, I'm blown away by all these things that I'm seeing that you're doing in this time. Is so heartwarming to know that, you know, you're thinking about other Nigerians in other countries to risk going to bring them back, and also showing me how the safety precautions you're taking, you know, that was really good. And Target also did that in terms of showing, you know, sending out a note. Their CEO sent out a note to say, this is what we're doing to make sure that, you know, we're cleaning and, you know, we're keeping you safe as, you know, you shop, or keeping our employees safe so they can serve you properly. So, you know, these are some examples that, that were really, really heartwarming. Then on the government side, we saw some governments you know, step up, right, to the plate to say, look, we showing empathy. For example, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, just saying that she was and has been phenomenal, right?
She set the standard, I think.
Yeah. She really, really did set the standard for a lot of people, because it's not like she's saying something super scientific or anything. She is just being personable. She's just being a human.
A human to human, yeah.
And communicating in the words that, you know, I understand, or
exactly.
You know, resonate. I think that was very, very good. And, you know, she focused mostly, she reinforced the health messages, focused on solidarity, collective action, kindness, mental health, and left more of the more detailed, you know, scientific work to the director of health. Or she reinforced, but you could see that they were working in tandem. And South Korea also set a precedence like that as well, in the sense that, you know, their head of the CDC was, you know, doing a lot more of the scientific, and the president was speaking about sympathy, resilience, solidarity. Chancellor Merkel in Germany did a phenomenal job as well. She was one of the really strong leaders that we saw as well. And, you know, we had their virologists or the health professionals also step up, you know, to the plate as well. On the African angle, South Africa did a really good job as well. Even though the president made some gaffes from time to time, but, felt that he he at least, came up, he was present, and, he did speak to a lot of the constituents and their fears, right? So that was really great as well. I think that's some of the examples that I'll put out without speaking
positive,
too much,
well,
but,
we touched on
it's a lot.
so many good aspects. The crisis scenario-based training you alluded to early is just, it's not a matter of, an option, really. It really needs to be built into every communications strategic plan, and just being prepared and making it up on the fly, or on the job training in a crisis is a recipe for disaster to even make the crisis escalate. So having that training on a regular basis, because then you have some muscle memory. Not to say that you, again, as you alluded to, we have to be agile and flexible and aware of the particular things going on in this crisis that are a little out of the norm or something unexpected. So staying agile and flexible, but having that training. So again, you can call on it, and you can be not the deer in the headlights, but you can be the source of professional control, calm, confidence, all of those things that your stakeholders are looking for and, quite frankly, demand of organizations during a crisis, because they will take their buying power and their loyalty elsewhere. We've seen so many studies now about CEO activism on societal issues, government issues, and how consumers are holding a high bar for leadership in organization to take a stand on certain things. And if they don't, or if they take one they disagree with, they will easily go elsewhere, take their dollars elsewhere. So all of this, to me is, a positive in terms of elevating the understanding of the critical nature of professional communication across organizations, government, NGOs, nonprofits, whatever it might be. And hopefully that will remain, and more strategic communication leaders will be at that decision-making table in more organizations going forward. Because I don't think anyone could appreciate internal communication as much as they do now. But I tell you what, leaders and organizations are going, where's my internal comms person? Help, I don't know how to talk to my employees. I don't know how to talk to my leadership. So that communication person has really stepped up, and that's been a positive thing. So we saw, you mentioned some good examples. Now, who are the bad and the ugly?
I didn't want to categorize bad and ugly, so
well, the ones who learned a lot.
I will try. I think just having this conversation is a segue into leadership in crisis, right? Because when all is said and done, there are certain faces that organization or governments flaunt as their leaders, right? When there's a crisis period, or when there's a crisis, really. The one that has just shocked me this month, which is out in the news, that the Norway Prime Minister was fined for flouting COVID-19 rules. This is a Prime Minister of Norway. And she had a birthday celebration in these times, and it went over the numbers that were stipulated. And I would just give some similar examples, and we'll talk about what the lessons there are. In April last year, there was a high-profile funeral in Nigeria of the chief of staff who died from COVID, but it was attended by a lot of people, no social distancing, nothing. And that was major. And, it also had a lot of backlash for the work, even the CDC was doing, or what the government was trying to tell people, because it was like there are double standards everywhere. In December, Rod Phillips, Ontario minister, took a vacation to the Caribbean, but released pictures as if it was at home. And so he flouted the COVID rules of not, going anywhere.
And it happened here too with,
I know.
Politicians getting on planes and
so
going to...
it goes on and on. It happened in Ireland, it's happened in the UK, and people have resigned their positions. And most of them are, government officials. So my question is, and what I always say to people, it's very easy to tell a communicator, oh, write all these, key messages and amazing messages and, saying this is what you should do. But leadership is really by example. People lead by what you say, and what you actually do is most times more important than what you say. Absolutely. Because you can say one thing and do another, which we've seen. So people are not compelled to follow the restrictions or the rules, because the people they look up to who are setting these rules are flouting them. So it's really bad.
It's really bad. It causes all sorts of disconnect and distrust and
mistrust, disconnect, adherence very low in places that things like this happen, because they're like, if you can do it, then I can do it. So, let's be even, let's be square. Some other examples I'll bring up are some companies that, did not really listen to their stakeholders or the needs of people in terms of what information they were putting out. And some of you must have seen it or not. The first one I'll talk about is KFC. During COVID launched, a commercial where people were eating chicken, sticking their hands in their mouth. And this was during COVID period. And it was huge.
Finger looking good. Remember that?
I understand that in the normal time, this is okay for you, but now it's not okay, because they're telling people, you can transmit COVID with your hand or whatever. I'm not saying that we don't know that people still eat, we all eat, but reinforcing that type of message on a platform like this, is not being sensitive, to what exactly is going on. Even Hershey also had a commercial where strangers were hugging and shaking hands over, gifts of chocolate. And you would think, right? We're saying social distancing. We don't want people hugging who are strangers. In a family, close-knit, it happens indoors, right? But they're all in together and isolating and things like that. So it makes sense, for it to happen, in that way. So those were some of, I mean, there are a lot of examples of companies that, didn't quite get the mark. But for me, these were some of the ones that, stood out for me, causing, the highest heartache or, kind of disruption to the system. The ugly, Diane, I don't know if you want to hear this. We had this conversation.
Absolutely.
The US wasn't entirely the best in leading us during, the normal COVID, in the heat and thick of things, right? Whether it was from leadership not acting on time or believing that COVID was real. But also, I think one that really just even affected Nigerians, you can imagine, I don't know other countries, was the statement on chloroquine. And that was major. Or taking bleach. Let's not go into all of that.
Did you actually see some incidents of people believing it?
So a lot of conversation on social media, and for us, right, because when I've been supporting the Nigeria Center for Disease Control, and there have been incidents, right, when Ebola came, to West Africa and all of that, people were drinking salt water and things like that. So it was a very big fear because we did not see any incidents that I'm aware of, but, a lot of people, it was a mixed feeling, right? We feel this, maybe there's a conspiracy to keep us away from drinking chloroquine that we know, would protect us. Maybe that's even the reason why Nigerians are not getting a lot of COVID, because a lot of us take it for malaria, and maybe it has built immune systems. So it spiraled, right? And you would also find out that in that period, the price of chloroquine went up.
Oh my gosh.
So it's in some ways, right? Thank God we didn't think about or get fatal reports, right? But it could have been.
Yes.
Right. And one of the things that the Nigeria Center for Disease Control did immediately was to release a statement almost immediately to say, we have not, we follow the science at every point in time. If they say that chloroquine is useful for us, then there's no need keeping, Nigerians away from it. But right now, it's not something that has been proven. So maybe to exercise caution and just, wait. So for me, that was a very ugly one, because it could have turned in different ways that, we wouldn't have expected, because America is looked up to a whole lot in different countries, right? There's a very huge fan base in Nigeria as well, who would also believe, based on the role that the US has played, whether it's international politics or public health or anything, that on its own, for me, it takes the crown.
Yeah.
I'll be happy to hear from other people in terms of, some other examples, but that one for me, took the crown.
Well, right. And then, communicators are now dealing, so part of crisis management, preparedness, response, and communication has to do with a crisis not of your own making, not that had anything to do with your organization or how you do business, but it's someone else's crisis that now has become your crisis and you have to deal with it. So, we think about, what are the top 3 things that keep you up at night about what could happen to your business or your organization or your enterprise? What is the one that is most likely to happen? And we train around that one, right? But on the other hand, you have this other pool of potentials that you have to think outside of your normal business frame of mind, not an operational crisis or not an environmental crisis or whatever. It could be another company that damages your reputation by association. So how do you deal with that? So just all of that preparedness. And COVID, circling back around, it was how politics exacerbated communication response by organizations.
Yeah, so that was a very big challenge, right? I wouldn't say it was totally bad, because in some countries it worked. That the political figures got involved. In some other countries it didn't work. Where politics trumped the response itself, right? It trumped science, basically. And I can see that from, looking at different countries, looking at certain aspects of the work I did myself, but at the same time, I think one thing that really was important is like the scanning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Scanning conversations, what is happening around you as a communicator. So research is actually very, very important. In peacetime, so it's like watching issues and things
Sure.
like that. And when you're even in the crisis, as you mentioned, for example, the funeral of, the chief of staff was a very big crisis for us, which it wasn't a big one, wasn't one of our making, but because something happened outside of, the work that we did, but it was deemed government, right? So they're saying government is saying XYZ, and you're telling us XYZ, but you're still government. So who do we believe? What do we do? So it becomes a big issue there. And so it's that scanning, trying to make sure that you're constantly, like for me, I had a team who was focused on data mining conversations that are happening, misinformation, so that way you're not surprised at what is
Stay on
coming.
top of it and respond
Also
in a timely.
spend a good chunk of my time, maybe early in the morning, in the middle of the day, and before I sleep at night, also scanning conversations that are happening, because we also had to brief our principals to say, this is what might be talked about tomorrow, even if it doesn't necessarily affect us directly, but we need to craft a response or have something ready to say in terms of what our stance is, because we don't want to be taken unawares at any point in time. So that was a very critical aspect of the work that we did. And I agree with you, for communicators to sit on the table. It's absolutely important. I was in a lot of meetings. I knew what was going on in terms of the response. Like at the back of my palms, I always tease that I have a master's in public health, and specifically health emergencies now, because I knew what the technical teams were doing. I would ask questions, I would probe. I would also foresee where there will be a problem and try to plug it in or push it back to who could address it, so it doesn't come back on my table as a comms issue. So it's kind of
deciding, whether it was an operational, a managerial, or a communications response. So talking about scanning, we know how critical it is to have a media monitoring company or partnership, or even if you have an internal team doing that. So what do you normally see out there in terms of media monitoring, and how did you use that in your response?
So even prior to COVID, just by virtue of the work that the NCDC does in terms of responding to health emergencies, the scanning systems were always there. It's called TATAFO. So it scans conversations with key words based on the diseases that were under our jurisdiction, right? So you're always watching to see what's being said on social media, but also going to the communities as well. There was a feedback process, for the communities to provide information as well on the conversations that are happening, or, something that they had noticed. But for us, in addition to that, we did a lot of Google alerts, as well, using TweetDeck, to set up as well, just to see the conversations that were going on. And during the core crisis period, I used a little bit of Meltwater also, which was really fantastic, because it kind of aggregated. So I mean, I think this is also going to the conversation of artificial intelligence, machine learning, supporting the work that communicators do, because you need this data, right? You need to mine this data to be more effective in your communications at any point in time. So how do companies, become more effective using, different products that are now available to support in doing that type of work? So we used, also use like statistics from Facebook and Twitter and Instagram as well. Also honing in on the particular posts that we put out. How is it doing? Is it resonating with the audience or not? Did it do well in terms of the views or reshares and all of that or not? For us to also know, should we do something different? So I think that it's pretty much using different channels, because that was what was available to me, and I needed this data at every point in time on a weekly basis. But I think for COVID specifically, there was an additional layer of working with polling agencies, right, to put out national polls and also mine the data from there as well, to contribute to the response, the communications response itself. So,
did you use any sort of a survey tool beyond just media monitoring? As we know, the media monitoring is great for the data points, but it's up to communicators to translate that into something meaningful for their stakeholders and communicate in a meaningful way, as you say, that resonates with the various stakeholder groups, because data is data and everyone can interpret it differently.
Yeah.
So it's up to us to make meaning out of that. But do you do just old-fashioned surveys, or did you use surveys, or do you use them in your communication response as you're going through it to take the temperature of your stakeholders?
So because we were very heavily involved in the polling, and because we needed national perspective, right? So we relied on the polling companies to, do the polls or surveys, to get us information on that level, right? But with the vaccination, I saw that there were some surveys that went out in terms of just trying to get a pulse of, how people would accept, or, what their fears were, and, just demographics as well. So I thought that was good. But at the point in time we were working, it wasn't possible to do a lot on your own. So that's why I said those partnerships were very important to the work that we did. So some things that we could not prioritize at that point in time, we partnered with people who were already doing it, or got the data from the people who were already doing it, and used that to inform the work that we're doing. But for the national polling, we were in conversation on a weekly with the organization doing it, and also infuse some of the conversations that we had mined into, getting it out on a bigger scale to get the information that we needed at that point in time.
Would love to hear from anyone. Just take yourself off mute and volunteer any comments, any questions, any feedback. Join us in conversation. We have about 6 minutes left. Anyone? Everyone's super quiet today. Well, feel free to stay in touch, everyone, through E4. We do, and watch out for the hashtag.
I see a hand up. So.
Yeah, E4Com series. And we do have, somebody's raising their hand, it looks like.
Yeah.
Feel free to jump in. Oh, fantastic. Hello.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you very much. My name is Olutayo Rochola from Lagos, Nigeria. I'm so glad to hear somebody from Nigeria speak. That is Ajebe. I might not be able to call the first name very well. Yukori, if I'm not mistaken. She's really giving us something very insightful, and it's really a lot. Prior to now, I used to have this idea that it's best to have the head of an organization speak as a spokesperson, but I can see reason to why another person would also be part of the conversation. I give an instance now. During the NSAS protest that rocked Nigeria last year, October, we could see that people were really interested in having the president speak. And when they couldn't hear from him, the crisis continued. And unfortunately, when he spoke, it was like the hope of a lot of people crashed. You know, so where I'm just going with that is, in as much as we would like to have different spokespersons, for instance, the case of NCDC having to interface across media, across medium, across the country with 6 geopolitical zones, it makes a lot of sense. But when it comes to the headship, the total headship, like the president of Nigeria, I think it's really, really important to stress the need for them to be very, very media savvy, so that we avoid a situation wherein they will come up with speeches that will dampen the heart of people rather than seeing the empathy that everybody had looked forward to getting at such a critical time.
Absolutely.
So it's something that's very nice, and it's good seeing her come up with different case studies from across the world for the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we hope that this session will make all of us a better communicator going forward. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Jessica, and every other person that is involved. It's really a great one, and I look forward to more of this. Thank you.
Well said. Well said. Thank you.
Thank
And I
you.
love the applause that we're getting from Laiza. Any last words of wisdom you'd like to share, Yukori?
For me, this world of crisis communications also just, came on me with COVID heavy, right? So prior to that, done issues management here and there. But for me as a communicator, it was really hectic, right? A lot to learn, a lot to catch up on. Like now, if I see the crisis comms plan I had in December of 2019.
It was like your planning calendar for 2022. Just kind of like
it's like night and day, because like you're thinking to yourself, what exactly is going on here? But it's with the learnings, right, that I hope that organizations and governments start to plan for the next big thing that is going to rock, because there will always be something.
There'll
right?
always be something. Exactly.
So I think that's my final word for everyone to take that preparedness and planning and scenario planning very important, using the lessons that are available, right now to us, to ensure that we don't repeat the same mistakes, and that we engage the stakeholders that are involved a lot better through our actions, inactions, our messaging, and so basically those are my last words, and thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time and sharing all of your insights with us. We really so very much appreciate it.